Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Miska, Executive Director of First Amendment Voice. Are you concerned about the state of civil discourse in our country or maybe even in your own community? If you want to help FAV bring programming like the discussion you're getting ready to watch to others, please consider going to our website at firstamendmentvoice.org and click on the Join tab. You can learn about the benefits of membership and become a part of a movement reinvigorating and understanding about freedoms of speech, religion, the press, assembly, and petition. And if you like our videos, feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's First Amendment Voice, all one word, .org, O-R-G. Thank you, and enjoy the webinar. All right, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. This is the First Amendment Voice National Symposium, and it is in celebration of Constitution Day and Citizenship Day, which we celebrate every year in September. That day is actually tomorrow, September 17th, but we've had webinars going on all week and workshops. And so we come together to explore ideas of citizenship here. And of course, this is the first time we've done it virtual. So we're super excited to be able to change our programming. What it allows is we're able to bring in speakers from across the entire country, where usually it's a little bit harder to get people to fly to Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. So here we've got speakers from all across the country, and we're grateful that they've been able to join us. And I'll talk just briefly about them after telling you a little bit about this year's theme, which the overall context of the symposium is how the pandemic has shaped civic engagement. And so we look at that through the lenses of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, and to petition a government for grievance, which are all woven into the First Amendment. So we're super excited. This panel is going to look at how foreign events and actors actually impact the First Amendment. And it's although I'm sure the panelists will touch on the pandemic, they're going to get into other events and actors that can also impact how we express ourselves, that these freedoms are not static. They ebb and flow throughout our culture and our society. And so that's what this is all about. So I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. I would like to thank our volunteers who allow all this to happen. We've got wonderful volunteers. We've had wonderful sponsors come on to help get this programming out to a broader audience here in the US. And our members are just wonderful. And then lastly, I would like to thank our facilitator, moderator, Janessa Gans-Wilder, who is a friend and colleague. We served in Iraq together. She was in the CIA while I was in the Army. I wish that I had known her in Iraq. We didn't know each other then. We just met several years ago. And it's just been such a blessing to be able to work alongside you, Janessa. So I'm really appreciative anytime you're able to come in and facilitate important conversations like this. So thank you. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to you and First Amendment Voice for putting together this action-packed symposium that has been chock full of such important debates and discussions, and right at this amazing time when we have the election and the pandemic and everything happening, and you're bringing it to us virtually so that we don't have to fly to Philadelphia. We can engage in these important topics and vital topics right from our own home. So we are just so excited to get into it this morning. So as Steve mentioned, our topic this morning is foreign impact on First Amendment freedoms when a virus comes knocking. And I'm Janessa Wilder, I'm the moderator. We're gonna have three amazing panelists. We have Jose Smith, retired US Army Colonel, Gil Sanborn, a financial advisor, a guru of all sorts, and Melissa Hooper, a rule of law expert at Human Rights First. So just to give you the big picture of what to expect for our session, we have 90 minutes. We're going to hear a few minutes from each of our speakers, and then we will get straight into Q&A. And please don't be shy about any question is welcome. You can put it right there in the chat, in the Q&A button, and I will be monitoring those and make sure that we get to some of those during the Q&A portion. So just to give you a brief overview of our topic, I'm going to hit on 3 overarching points, which to me can kind of serve to frame our discussion this morning. The first one, which was fascinating to me, we all heard about Russian meddling in the last election, but to learn that this is actually not a new thing for an impact on our First Amendment freedoms, and it goes way back to the beginning. The presidential election of 1796, France was incensed that the US had signed this treaty, the Jay Treaty with Great Britain, even though they had supported us in the Revolutionary War. They had followed us on the path to their own revolution, but in a way we aligned ourselves with Great Britain, and so they were pressuring very hard to sway the election against Washington in favor of someone more amenable to their interests, which was Thomas Jefferson. They did that by lobbying officials. They did that by publishing articles against Washington. They even threatened that war would be imminent if Washington were reelected. So it's just so interesting to see this go right back to the beginning. And it was such an important topic of the day that it even inspired George Washington's farewell address, which has this quote, which I think is so pertinent to our times, nothing new under the sun, right? He writes, "Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government." So I want to, later on, I want to touch back on that topic of how can we as a people remain constantly awake and vigilant. The second point is the question of, well, should there be more foreign impact, but of the right sort? We see all sorts of meddling and lobbying from undemocratic countries, from foes of democracy. And why aren't the democratic ones trying to have more of an impact on American democracy and the practice of it? Just by way of example, Saudi Arabia has 32 active lobbying operations in Washington. Turkey has 10. The UAE has 21, whereas pro-democracy Europeans don't want to sully their hands. According to the American Registry of Foreign Lobbyists, the UK, France, Germany, and the Netherlands all have 0 lobbying operations in Washington. So that's a question of, why are we only getting one kind of foreign impact and influence and not maybe more of the right sort? Then the third point is just, let's bring it to the present, where with this coronavirus, everyday life in the US has been completely upended and is in a state of upheaval. We have this disruption, this sort of shock to our national system, which is causing fear and anger and is in a way creating a lot of fertile ground for disinformation, for conspiracy theory, for increasing distrust of our leaders, of our institutions, people distrusting each other. So what is that fertile ground allowing for foreign actors and foreign influence? Are we seeing more because of that? Are they taking advantage of that fertile ground? This revealing quote by a former director for the House Intelligence Committee, Michael Allen, said, "The country is in a state of trauma. People are angry. And when they're out there seeking information and it's readily available in a variety of forms, that's a ripe environment for foreign interference and disinformation." So that's kind of a third benchmark to frame our discussion today. So that is just a little bit by way of introduction. I want to get straight into introducing our first speaker, a friend of mine, Colonel Jose Smith. He is currently a consultant to the military, but he retired not long ago from the U.S. Army after over 28 years not to date you or anything, Jose, as a military intelligence officer and foreign area officer. Jose can speak firsthand to foreign impact. This is right up your wheelhouse, Jose. Born in England, raised in Spain, served in Colombia, El Salvador, Afghanistan, so many other garden spots around the world. Last year at this time, he was in the Ukraine, Heck, not long after that, we were in Geneva together. But despite his long career in intelligence, he has a keen eye and a big heart. With degrees in biology, pre-med, foreign languages, a master's in international relations from Baylor University, and a graduate of the Command and General Staff College. So Jose, I would love to turn it over to you and just get your sense, especially of the big picture of what we're seeing and what you've seen over your career in terms of foreign impact and influence on our freedoms.
Good morning, and thank you, Janessa, for that warm introduction. As Janessa said, I'm Jose Smith. I'm a retired Army Colonel, Intelligence and Foreign Area Officer. And for me, when I was asked to do this, I kind of was like, where do I fit? How do I fit in this? And we talked a little bit about the historical impact and some of the assignments that I've been in where I've seen the lack of certain freedoms or the messaging, from a messaging perspective, what and how do we message to other countries and how other activities affect messaging domestically here in the United States, but also affect our foreign policy. And historically, as Janessa pointed out, we've been a target for both friends and foes to influence public opinion and policy. We know that the United States is a democracy. It's a democracy that evolves, changes, and adjusts to what is going on around the world to protect its citizens. And when we look at the elements, instruments of power, diplomacy, military, information, the economy, we also know that those foes, adversaries, are going to look and target those using existing US laws and policies to develop, integrate, and implement their strategies, both short-term and long-term, to affect the way we do things here in the United States. Personally, for me, a lot of this began, as Janessa pointed out, I grew up in Spain. And I grew up during a dictatorship, which kind of dates me as well. The complete censorship, 2 television stations, both of them very censored, the news, the radio, television, as I pointed out, but also even the teaching in schools, the dialects that were not allowed to be publicly taught, the cultures that were not allowed to be publicly taught. All of that had to be done clandestinely. And what I wanted to do as part of my presentation this morning is really talk about the impact really during 2 time frames, more so from starting with the Cold War and the proxy wars, and then also transitioning to the post 9/11. For me, looking at the Cold Wars and those proxy wars, I was assigned in Germany in the late 80s, and I had an opportunity to see firsthand the border going into East Berlin, looking at the border with Czechoslovakia and pulling border duty, understanding what the military had to do to protect that border, understanding what the expectations were of the US military in conjunction with our allies to protect those borders, to protect a way of life. As I stated earlier, because of our democracy and our freedoms, there was always an intent by others, and always has been an intent by others, to affect it to attain their goals. During the same time frame, you had the insurgencies prior to and including during the Cold War in Vietnam and Latin America. 2 very distinct areas, both had insurgencies, both with ideas to affect how things were happening here in the United States. From a personal perspective, I was assigned, I had the privilege of being assigned to one of those garden spots that Janessa talked about, El Salvador, in the early 90s, right at the very end of the Civil War. And watching how post Nicaragua, the Iran-Contra issues, and then watching what was happening in El Salvador as El Salvador transitioned from a extreme, also right-wing government to a democracy, and how they had to go through that, how the US messaging was there, how all of the foreign influence that was there, to include the Russians, and at that point still the fallout of the Soviet Union, how they were trying to influence what the American public saw, what the international public saw about what was happening in El Salvador. And I had an opportunity there as a military intelligence advisor to see that, because I dealt with not only the Salvadoran military, but I also dealt with a lot of the UN forces that were there and watched how they interacted with their headquarters, what kind of information they were reporting back. And in a lot of instances, they were working with us, with me, to make sure that the messaging was correct. I'd like to fast forward a little bit to 9/11 and post 9/11. We talk about the global war on terrorism and also narco-terrorism, the state and stateless sponsorship of terror, attacks on US soil, the drug trade combined with insurgency. All of these events, all of the events tied to these were geared towards affecting freedoms here in the United States. Had an opportunity to serve in Colombia, looking at the effects of narco-terrorism, not only on that country, but also on the effects that it had here, how it affected freedoms here, rights that we had here in the United States, and how those restrictions began to become in place. This was shortly after 9/11. We saw the Patriot Act come into effect. That was greatly approved by all members, most members of Congress, which gave certain authorities and privileges to US authorities to conduct counterterrorism operations and to prevent future terrorist attacks. Also, my time in Central Command, US Central Command, focused on events in the Middle East, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and seeing other countries, looking at the messaging there. We had allies and coalitions in both parts. That was part of our effort to control and counter the influence that was coming in from other countries. Immediately after returning from Afghanistan, where I worked a lot with biometrics and forensics, expeditionary biometrics and forensics, I was heavily recruited by a Far East power, unsuccessfully recruited by a Far East power to come and talk to them about how to maximize the use of biometrics and forensics from an expeditionary perspective. This was something that they wanted to be able to do really in a controlling way in their own population. Again, trying to look at how to best control their information using lessons learned that we had from combat operations, multiple countries, multiple ethnicities, multiple sets of laws. How did we, domestic and international, and how we were able to do that. And then really to wrap it up, I wanted to talk a little bit about how things were, as we get closer and closer to today's world and to the impact that COVID is having, we see a lot of the campaigns. And these are from across the spectrum, both information, disinformation, affecting the elections, as you've already heard, sowing public distrust in the government, racial strife and injustices here in our own country, and how to take advantage of any and all of those activities and really focus and push and affect the way we do business here in the United States, the way our government works, and affect those instruments of power that I spoke to earlier. And I will turn this back over to Janessa. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. I know there's so many stories up your sleeve of seeing that foreign impact directly. And hopefully we can get on the Q&A on what is the kind of messaging that you were working with, and how were they trying to craft it, and what did they think would really speak to the American audience. But thank you so much for getting us started, and we'll go now to Gil. Gil Sanborn has his hands in all sorts of financial advisory pots, helping clients make sense of an ever-evolving landscape. He's president of Great Circle Advisors, a financial advisory firm, and retired chair of the restructuring advisory practice at Barclays Capital. He was advisor to several clients in the Euro crisis. Gil started the restructuring group at Lehman Brothers in 2001, much needed, and was an investment banker at Credit Suisse, First Boston, and at Citibank. He speaks to civilian and military groups in California on national security challenges since 9/11, which I understand you saw the Twin Towers fall from just the next door building. Gil also gives frequent talks on national security, including Russian information warfare, which will be really relevant to our topic. He got his BA in Chinese Studies and Economics from the University of Michigan and his MBA from Harvard Business School. So Gil, I'd love to turn it over to you for your perspective.
Thanks very much, Janessa. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel with such distinguished fellow panelists here, particularly given the foreign expertise that Jose and Melissa and you bring to this discussion. I'm going to narrow my discussion really to Russia here because Russia is so much in the news today. I think what they're doing is very misunderstood, but it really represents a serious threat to us. And what I'm going to talk about really are three topics: their use of information warfare as an express national strategy against the US and other democracies, the tactics and tools that they and other malevolent actors use specifically on social media, and that's going to be my topic, my focus today. And then from our standpoint, the importance of an all-of-nation national strategy to combat this. Russia has many other dimensions of their influence or really attacks against us in addition to social media. Covert money and the use of what's called malign finance is critical and much misunderstood and very dangerous for us, and then cyber as well. I'm going to talk on social media because that's the dimension in which most of us operate here and one in which their influence needs to be understood. Just a comment on terminology that's used with respect to misuse of social media and media in general. Disinformation is the term that I'm really going to focus on, and an accepted definition is it's all forms of false, inaccurate, or misleading information which is designed and presented and promoted to intentionally cause harm or profit. Misinformation is simply information that's inaccurate or misleading, but it's shared by people who don't recognize it as such. And then the most common term is fake news, that oftentimes is referring to disinformation, but fake news really is just coverage that the user of that term simply finds to be disagreeable. Disinformation, or in its raw terminology, information warfare, has been part of influence for decades and centuries, as Jose has discussed and Melissa will talk about, but it's really a central component of Russia's strategies against its perceived enemies after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that collapse really was what caused Vladimir Putin to develop a strategy when he came into power that reflected what happened to be the contraction of the borders of the Soviet Union, the expansion of NATO, and then those border countries that had been part of the Warsaw Pact and created a buffer between the Soviet Union and the West became part of that NATO structure. So Russia saw itself as a much smaller nation. At the same time, they were weakened militarily and economically. So information warfare became part of what was an asymmetric warfare approach toward the West. Many people may dispute the concept of use of information warfare by Russia, but to dispel any uncertainty, I'm going to quote from a document that the Ministry of Finance released in 2011 that defined information warfare as the ability to undermine political, economic, and social systems to carry out mass psychological campaigns against the population of a state in order to destabilize society and the government, and then force the state to make decisions in the interest of their opponents. That was in 2011, mind you, which was 5 years before their involvement in the 2016 elections. Their objectives is part of the information warfare strategy are several-fold. It's obviously to influence and steer elections, not only here in the United States, but Brexit in the UK and elections across Europe, to create distrust of government institutions and create confusion about facts. To bracket the issue of whether or not information really exists, we have Russia on one side with their official policy. In 2017, the National Security Strategy was published. It's on the White House website. And in that, it stated, today actors such as Russia are using information tools in an attempt to undermine the legitimacy of democracies. Adversaries target media, political processes, financial networks, and personal data. And it concludes by stating no external threat can be allowed to shake our shared commitment to our values, undermine our system of government, or divide our nation. The issue in terms of how far Russia will go with information warfare, with cyber, with covert money, I think was captured by some testimony by General Paul Nakasone as Joint Commander of Cybercom and the NSA in front of the House Intelligence Committee this spring, where he talked about the historical nature of training cyber forces like any other military force to prevail in future conflict. But the issue we have today is adversaries like Russia compete below the threshold of armed conflict, short of triggering the hostilities that the Department of Defense has traditionally prepared. And in that short of war competition features cyber and information operation employed by nations in which that bypass our conventional military strength. So what it means, and this is my editorial comment, is we need a different approach that addresses the reality of how these dimensions play through against our democracy. Social media is really the most fertile ground. And as Jose has referenced, it deals with the issue that we have an open society with the right to free speech, and nations that don't allow the same openness on their side are taking advantage of the most dynamic platform, and that is social media, to affect operations against us. A couple of things important to note in terms of how the Russians and other malevolent actors operate. They use conspiracy theories and false narratives. And we're vulnerable to conspiracy theories because we want cohesion, we want understanding and accuracy. Conspiracy theories give us that. We want control and security. And we also want to maintain a positive image of ourselves. So if we subscribe to a conspiracy theory that others do as well, and we're part of that group. False narratives are really lies and untruths, and they're designed to grab people's attention, to create an emotional reaction, and also build on people's narratives. Social engagements, which are likes and retweets and reposts, shares in other words, take advantage of the way that Russia and other operators play in social media. When you as a social media user see content in your feed, you're drawn to those that have multiple likes and multiple shares. The greater those shares, the greater those engagements, the less likely you are to fact check, the more likely you are to share, especially with content that has low credibility. These drivers were established long before 2016, both on Facebook and Twitter, in order to create these social engagements that then allowed you as unsuspecting users to amplify the reach. Matthew Armstrong testified in front of the House Armed Services Committee in a 2017 hearing, which was titled, the hearing was titled, Crafting an Information Warfare and Counter-Propaganda Strategy for the Emerging Security Environment. He was former governor, head of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. He said the following with respect to a national strategy: we're on our heels, we're responsive and reactive, and we don't have a strategy. When you look to Europe and NATO, EU, both nations and supranational organizations, they've had strategies for years. What is said so often, both in testimony in front of Congress, as well as among those organizations that focus on disinformation and other incursions that we face, is we need an all-of-government, all-of-nation strategy. That has to start at the federal government. It should include a coalition of government private and public stakeholders. It should include media literacy that Melissa will talk about, transparency, a diverse free press, which is contracting at this point, and no profit from disinformation and counter messaging. So with that, let me turn it back to you, Janessa.
Sobering, Gil, thank you. Sobering and chilling. Let's go to Melissa to round out our panel here. Melissa Hooper is a lawyer and rule of law expert who has worked in Russia, Ukraine, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and most recently here at home on reforming legal systems and protecting individual rights and freedoms. Her research and policy focus at Human Rights First also includes foreign interference, disinformation, kleptocracy, and corruption, and increasing the resilience and independence of democratic institutions. Boy, do we need that here at home. Most recently, she's written on Russia's corrupt influence schemes, democratic backsliding through use of disinformation and attacks on the judiciary in Central Europe, and methods of protecting human rights as governments seek to grab power during the pandemic. Melissa teaches international human rights law at Arizona State University and is on the board of the Free Russia Foundation and the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group of the German Marshall Fund. So with you, Melissa, let's get into this topic even more.
Great. Thank you so much, Janessa. I am very excited to talk with you all and to be on this panel with my co-panelists. Thank you. Let's see, I think that I will talk maybe a little bit more specifically about the goals of foreign influence and maybe some examples of what we see on a maybe more daily basis of what foreign interference can look like and how it affects our ability to exercise free speech and First Amendment rights. Then I'll talk a little bit about the pandemic and how that is impacting these issues and how disinformation can take hold. And then I'll talk a bit specifically about what we can do as individuals to combat disinformation, to try to protect democracy and democratic institutions. And then we'll see where we are. So I came to the issue of foreign influence and interference and disinformation actually over time working in the former Soviet Union and Eurasia. But then when I worked in Russia in from 2011 to 14, my organization, my NGO, started seeing the Russian government putting out information that was false and directly countering the information we were trying to put out. So as an organization that's a US-based organization, we went to the State Department and said, look, we're seeing a lot of false information. It might be interesting or helpful if the US government could think about how it could counter this and maybe try to put out true information to help balance the information people are getting in Russia. And the State Department said to us, we're not in the business of communications. This really is not our concern. But later on, they did, I think, recognize that it is very much of our concern because these strategies start in Russia, start from the Russian government perspective, and then they're used elsewhere. So we were seeing, I think, some effective strategies that were later used overseas. So as Gil discussed, when we're talking about specifically Russian operations, their goal is to make democracy look chaotic and ineffective. Essentially create, as Gil said, distrust and divisions within our societies such that there's chaos here and that Putin can say, look, this democracy, it doesn't look like it's functioning at all. There's racial strife, their institutions aren't working. Why would you want democracy? That doesn't seem to work at all. And so in doing so, creating this distrust, we're often talking about what Russia is trying to do. And I want to bring out the converse of that, which is that the way democracy functions and the basis for democracy is that we are able to work across different groups. We're able to compromise, we're able to work in institutions with people who think very differently from us. So our ability to support the democratic project requires that we do that. And at this time, when we are seeing foreign interference and we're seeing distrust start to grow in our institutions, our ability to work across differences is combating foreign interference. So we can maybe think of it in that way at this time and try to put in the effort from that perspective. I also just wanted to draw out something else that Gil mentioned, which is that in the Russian strategy, it says it wants to affect psychological changes. And when you talk about social media and what social media does, it is not just about fake accounts or fake ads or bots and trolls. It really is the weaponization of emotion and the creation of that emotion to try to get individuals to spread false information and then be unwitting tools in the spread of this false information. And tech companies use this, and their algorithms, help this out, and we can talk about that later. But I want us to then also think about how our emotions play in social media. And I'll talk specifically about how we can check that and think about that a bit in the later part of my talk. So most recently, when we're talking specifically about Russia, we're seeing campaigns that are much less overt, and they're using local actors, so they're much more difficult to track and identify. So instead of Russian language sites that might have some either Russian language or some English mistakes, you're seeing that what Russia is doing is hiring local actors and even paying for their social media profiles so that they can use current trends and language and information from locals to spread disinformation. We're seeing this in Africa right now, the Central African Republic, Sudan, for example. And so coordinated social media campaigns are harder to identify as foreign influenced. We also see a lot of closed groups, especially on Facebook. Unfortunately, Facebook is not good at dealing with this, but we see the use of closed groups because these groups trust each other. There's a lot of trust among a group that all agrees with each other or tends to agree. And so low quality or false information can spread like wildfire. There isn't that sunlight that comes with the marketplace of ideas that we're all familiar with. So when we spread that, when we take a step back and look at what governments are doing in general, not just Russia, we see that it is, of course, not just Russia that is impacting US First Amendment and free speech. We have many governments that are impacting what's happening here. One example that I've personally experienced is bullying by foreign individuals and governments, and that is when NGOs or journalists are publishing information about corrupt activities or human rights violations of individuals, so individual oligarchs, I might say, or about a foreign government, let's say China's camps in Xinjiang, that you will see foreign governments directly contacting those individuals and threatening to sue them or making other threats against them to prevent that information from coming out. And unfortunately, it's effective because a lot of journalistic organizations just can't afford lawsuits, and same with NGOs. Incidentally, one of the most common defamation lawsuits has to do with the word oligarch. Just that's plain and simple. You also see something I call image laundering or oligarch washing, where oligarchs will or governments will create these philanthropic institutions to try to draw attention away from their harmful activities. A good example is Mohammed bin Salman creating his Miska Foundation to try to promote culture and call himself a philanthropist to try to draw attention away from the fact that he masterminded the killing and sawing up of a journalist from the US, Jamal Khashoggi. You also see, as Janessa mentioned, the hiring of PR directors and campaigns and lobbying activities. We've seen a Chinese company get sanctions removed that were applied by the US Commerce Department with a 3-month, $1.5 million lobbying campaign that was effective. The Congo and Oleg Deripaska from Russia also saw sanctions on them removed as the result of heavy lobbying campaigns. And then election funding and ads. Foreign governments should not be able to affect elections, but it's true that they can as a result of Citizens United, a case that came down from the Supreme Court that essentially allows governments to, through PACs, political action committees, give money to issue-oriented political action committees with no limit. So you can see foreign money come into US politics, and that's an area we should think about reforming. So I'm running out of time. So I'm gonna just say a little bit about the pandemic and then wrap up. As Janessa said, we're operating within an environment that is very traumatic. It is very difficult to identify what information is true or false. The World Health Organization identified an infodemic that came with the pandemic, which is to say that it's not that we have a lack of access to information, we have too much information. We're overwhelmed with information, and it's hard for us to distinguish what's true, what's false. We've never been in a pandemic like this before, so we don't know where to look. And we also, Gil, I think, referenced this, we want to grab onto certainty. So when we find information that will give us that certainty, even if it's false, we have this tendency to grab it. So this is an environment where we see disinformation grow. And we're seeing governments use that. For example, we've seen Saudi Arabia involved in the war in Yemen, using the pandemic to put out false information about their opponent, the Houthis in Yemen, saying that, for example, they are shooting people with COVID-19, so trying to gain sympathy for their side in the war. You have a lot of states that are creating fake news laws, saying that you cannot promote fake news or propaganda or incite hysteria about the pandemic, and using that to arrest individuals, journalists, and regular individuals who put out information that the government doesn't like. Not necessarily false information, but just what the government doesn't like. So legislating prohibitions on disinformation, generally not a good idea. And then you see also information being put out about communities, minority communities, that is false, essentially generating harm and violence against those communities. So for example, in Burma, Myanmar, you saw a lot of information about how the Rohingya are bringing the pandemic into Burma. And that's false, but it resulted in a lot of violence against that community. So we're in a period of greater susceptibility. Governments are not dealing with it well. Governments need to be providing clear, accurate information. Under Article 19, this is an international law requirement. They're not doing it. And so individuals need to be more focused on what they can do. So I will just say maybe two things about what individuals can do. It's important that we be very self-aware in our media consumption. As I said, emotion plays a great part in what tech companies allow to happen. They are there to monetize our attention. Basically, they're selling our attention spans. And so they don't care what information we're getting as long as they get their likes and they get their views. So we need to be thinking about, when we are viewing information, how is this making me feel? What's the goal of this piece? Is its goal to make me angry, make me react, or is it giving me information? And is it giving me balanced information? Whether you talk about, I've seen this for European countries like Poland, but also the US, people tend to share more false information ahead of an election than true information. So in your reading of articles, think about the balance, think about the sourcing, think of checking multiple sources, think of indices of reliability. And I'm not talking about, are there good pictures, which is what, there are studies that show that middle schoolers think a lot of pictures make something more reliable. It's not true. It's not about whether it rises high in the algorithm and it's the first choice. No, all of these things are not indices of reliability. So we need to be using common sense at this time, especially when we're going through a pandemic. Okay, I'll stop there. Sorry for the overrun.
Goodness, not at all, Melissa. That is very disturbing that we tend to share more false information than true ahead of an election. And another phrase that jumped out at me was the weaponization of information. And that connects to Gil's thing too. This is information warfare. What are we doing? What's the strategy to counter that? But the weaponization of information playing out every day on our social media feeds. There it is. And connecting to our emotions, that deep emotional state that we don't even know when we're unwitting passers on of those weapons. So thank you to our three panelists so much for just so much meat in each of your shares that we can get more into. I want to urge the attendees, any question that comes to your mind, we really want to engage with what is top of mind for you. You can click on the Q&A and just chat it in there. No question is dumb. Believe me, I'll be asking lots of them. So please engage with us. So I want to, this is for all of you, but we're 4 years later than 2016, and you touched on it a bit, Melissa, but I just want to, let's flesh out. So did Russia learn something from the last election? Do you see evolving tactics and strategies this time around? And also, was their meddling serve as inspiration to other countries? Are we seeing other actors and players wanting to engage even more heavily in this year's, in the 2020 elections or in our democracy, based on all the news that Russia's influence garnered? So now that we're 4 years later, what are we seeing in the landscape out there? And whoever wants to jump in first of you is great. Okay, Melissa.
Sure. I can start us off. I think that we are seeing a more, I don't know, the word would be more covert use of, for example, social media tools, but also a combined use of tools. And so, as I mentioned, we're seeing, for example, Russia using more collaborations with local partners. And it's not all a masterminded collaboration. Sometimes it is the fact that Russia has been able to figure out how to game systems and game attention spans and game social media algorithms. And so they can get information in, but they're also, they're paying local people to use their accounts. And so they've figured out that they need a local presence. And it may be that you have, local individuals not necessarily knowing that they're working with the Russian government, but they're paid by a lobbying organization to run a lobbying campaign. You also see, I'll move on. You also see other countries doing this. China has gotten much better at waging its social media campaigns. China, I think, actually learned from Russia. And so now you see China acting much more like Russia in waging its social media campaigns and trying to launder its reputation online and put out positive information or cover up information. And so I think that we are seeing much more effective and harder to identify strategies that are now, it's not just Russia, we're seeing a proliferation of strategies and even, some within the US.
Thanks, Melissa.
Maybe I'll jump in and reflect on the fact that what Russia did leading up to 2016 and following was to create this distrust, to create polarization. And if you look at the track of what they did around 2016 and continue to do, they stimulate and foster group focus around both sides of the political spectrum, as well as both sides of issues. So they'll stimulate and develop Facebook pages, Twitter accounts, et cetera, on both sides. And the intent really is to create attention, create user focus, and then provide for the clashes and provide for the distrust. So they.
Gil, we lost you for a second. Is he frozen for you all too? Okay. Okay, Gil, when you come back, we'll head back to you. But Jose, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted, to follow up on some comments I made earlier, and also to follow up on Gil and Melissa's comments about this is not a short term. None of this is short term. We here in a lot here in the United States, we look at stuff 4 years, 6 years, 8 years. Some of these countries have very, very long histories. And their strategies is a 25, 50 year, 100-year plan or whatever it may be. And one of the examples, as I was thinking through listening to some of the comments, was I remember sitting a few years ago in the Egyptian Defense Attaché's office and sitting there, and we were talking, and this is when the demonstrations were building, and this was against Morsi. And here, President Morsi was quote unquote democratically elected. He was in power. A lot of countries were saying, hey, this is a democratically elected government. We should let them operate the way they're operating. Yes, he has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. And they were very effective in some ways disassociating themselves with some of the jihadist and terrorist organizations, although we knew the links were there. And I'll never forget something that the attaché told me. He said, look, just look at the TV, because it was all in Arabic and I don't speak Arabic. I mean, maybe 5 or 6 words, but not fluently by any stretch of the imagination. And I sat there and he told me, look at the screen. There are a third of the Egyptian population is in the street protesting what's going on, this current administration and what they're doing to the people's rights. What would happen here in the United States if that were happening? Because the question I was really trying to find out is, how long is he going to last? How long is Morsi? There was no doubt that he could not last with the way things are going. And it was the next day. But I carefully listened to his words. How long, what would happen here in the United States if 100+ million people were in the streets protesting? There will be change. He didn't say when, he didn't say that would definitely happen. He just said what would happen. And so my point is on this specific story is, this is an event that had second and third order effects. Egypt was a very strong ally. There are a lot of things that we have done and continue to do with the Egyptian government. There are a lot of military ties. There are a lot of political ties with Egypt and its leadership as well. And so this was a way of messaging for them. Get those pictures out on camera. Show that there's a third of the population out on the streets. You know, a couple million people in Tahrir Square, and just really get that out there so that people could actually experience it as part of their messaging to the U.S. to affect our policies and laws.
Thanks, Jose. Very poignant example. And Gil, we lost you for a moment, but I see that you're back. If you want to pick up where you left off.
Where did I drop off? Does anybody remember? Well, let me just briefly say that what Russia did was to create a very fertile ground for other actors, nation states and other malevolent actors to play in this current arena because of the chaotic and polarization that was created with their work. So that continues. And it plays out, frankly, in issues that we face. For instance, the ability to utilize a vaccine, and the anti-vaxxers, both the explicit people here in the United States, for instance, people like Robert Kennedy Jr. And others are active, but also we see Russia and China stimulating distrust over the efficacy of vaccines, et cetera. So it's compounded, but essentially the work that Russia did has just created a much worse environment for us to operate in.
Thank you. It's layered and complex, and I hope we can get into a little bit more about that, about what motivates these actors to go to such great expense and effort. And it's so amazing that it's actually worth their time and effort that they're doing. But I wanted to turn to a question from a participant, Teresa. She writes, recently I've noticed on social media, I think it's Twitter, will attach a message to a tweet if the message contains misleading or disinformation about voting. The message then gives a link to get correct voter information. Why can't all social media platforms be more proactive in countering disinformation? If social media companies have so much power in controlling what we can see and what comes across our screens, it seems to me that they have a huge responsibility to do a better job as gatekeepers. What can we do to put pressure on, say, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, as a citizen? I recently watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix, which I highly recommend. It shows that our social media sites have played a huge part in shaping our views and allowing disinformation, which is behind a lot of the division in our country today. Thank you, Teresa. Wonderful, wonderful question. And I'll open it up to who wants to respond to that.
Well, I'll jump in unless somebody was on the edge of their seat. If you look at the various social media platforms, you'll see the evolution of internal policies that they've established to deal with questionable content. I think there's a view that the social media companies keep up with focusing on problematic content just enough to keep the wolves at bay, to keep the regulators at bay. But Twitter, I would say, is the most aggressive in terms of taking down bot accounts and also focusing on messages that are harmful and maybe totally incorrect, particularly in the political season. So Facebook is moving in that direction, but much slower, I think, for a variety of reasons. But I would suggest to people to go and look at each of the platform pages and look at their policies to understand what's being affected these days. I think I read yesterday that Facebook may in fact take down political posts a week or two before the elections themselves. So it is important. I think it's one way for us to deal with it, but there has to be pressure, I think, political pressure and public pressure, as well as advertiser pressure to increase the standards in addressing content that is truly disinformation.
Thanks, Gil. Anyone else, Jose or Melissa, want to add? Okay,
Sure.
Melissa.
Yeah, yeah, this great question. And, the question had so much in it also, showing that you really think about these issues. And I really appreciated that. And I agree, Facebook in particular is doing a terrible job of responding and does not seem to care that it has, it is taking actions that harm democracy. And not only, in the US, but we're seeing this in foreign countries where it's contributing to violent attacks. And I'll, slightly off topic, but Kara Swisher, a theorist on these issues who I think is good to read for, because she's very knowledgeable, but also very pessimistic, thinks that we should be requiring that social media companies actually pay monetarily when something harmful happens as a result of their policies, make it hit their pocketbooks. So I just want to point out that Facebook and Twitter and all of the social media companies, they have their terms of service, but Facebook itself has an internal law that details what it will keep up and what it will take down. That law is not public. We do not have access to it. So we do not know exactly what they will keep up and what they will take down. And we do see, operating for myself in the human rights sphere, that a lot of what is taken down tends to focus on those that are human rights activists or those that are minority communities, tend to have their information taken down at a higher rate. So yes, Facebook needs to do better. In terms of what can be done, we can talk about internal strategies, but I also think there needs to be greater regulation. And I think that in terms of pressure, talking to Congress is very important, telling your member of Congress that you think that this is something that is impacting you and that it's important that they take action. But also there are a number of civil society organizations that have come together and are have been trying to talk to Facebook about their problematic strategies, and they're having a week of action this week. So you may see on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, people that are saying they're freezing their accounts for today or for this week, essentially trying to urge Facebook to take greater efforts at supporting democracy with its policies. And I know that ADL, Anti-Defamation League, and Color of Change are two of the organizations involved, if you wanted to look that up.
So just to continue on this theme of disinformation, and this may be better for the tech panel, but do you have thoughts on where in the US are these disinformation strategies most successful and why?
when you say where in the U.S., are you talking about social groups as a dimension, Janessa?
I'm not sure. That's just what the question says. So it may be where geographically or where on the political spectrum. I'm not sure.
Well, I think, frankly, they're multidimensional. And one of the things you mentioned at the outset was that we need to be sure that we get out of bubbles. And if you look at social media in particular, each one of us is in a bubble by virtue of the algorithms that Facebook creates, that Google and search engines and YouTube create. So one of the recommendations in terms of regulation around this issue is that users have control of their own algorithms. I took a course this summer taught by KQED, the PBS station out here, on how to teach social media literacy, and it was directed to teachers. And one of the dynamics in exercises that we did caused me to look for certain type of content, and I was looking for disinformation. And with the subject that I put up, my Google search engine didn't give me any disinformation. It's probably because when it's come up in the past, I just don't look at it. But when I tried Bing, about 50% of the hits that I got were from sites that obviously were putting forth disinformation. So to me, it just reflected the dynamics there. So it's an important issue that I think we need to focus on in terms of legislation around it. But if you see on social media and the strategies of all of these different organizations, malevolent organizations, they'll find a group or create a group when they create a Facebook page or a Twitter account that draws in people of like interests. So it doesn't really matter what the theme is, but if they can draw people in and put forth content that stimulates them, then they can slip in the false narratives along the way. So I think it's important for us to recognize that in terms of our own habits.
I also would like to make a quick comment based off that, and I agree 100% with Gil. I think that a lot of it is this is a multifaceted question and answer, but I think a lot of it has to deal with the demographics of the people. When you talk about how is effective, who is it effective with and against, I look at we earlier in the discussion we talked about emotion. This is a very emotional time. This is especially because of COVID. People will become more emotional. They're locked in. They're having to deal with things that they've never had to deal with before. And so this information, Gil was talking about disinformation or misinformation that's out there. It is so much easier, it appears, to target certain groups based off demographics, based off the quality of the information that you put out there, knowing that this is inflammatory or will grab their attention immediately, and people just jump all over it. And as you said, a lot of times, some of the information you can actually go back and do research on, some of it you just can't. It's just not readily available. And when you look at, from the forum perspective, if I am in a place that is restrictive on what I can do there, it is a lot easier for me to come into the United States or have a source, if you would, here in the United States, put my messaging out for me in a way that I can still reach out and target those groups of people that are part of my strategy.
Jose, just thinking about your career, that we've moved from this heavy physical infrastructure, tank on tank warfare, to this very light, nimble online virtual warfare. How much more difficult is that to protect against? And do we even have that in mind, that is now that's the new front of warfare these days? Is the military thinking about that, do you think?
Well, I absolutely, and I think when Gil talked earlier about some of the different commands that are there, Cyber Command and other organizations that are out there that are specifically looking at that and how to defend against that, how they implement, how they work, coordinate with other departments, i.e. Department of State, Department of Energy, whatever, to specifically protect US interest here in the United States and also worldwide, and prevent us from getting into another full-up armed conflict, getting away from those tanks, because any of those events could potentially ignite an armed conflict. You know, one, now with the weapons that are out there, the way the information goes out, it's almost immediate as there's a missile strike, i.e. the Russian vehicles striking the US vehicles 3 weeks ago in Syria. That was a provocation. There was an intent there to see how far they could actually push US. What is the US reaction going to be to that incident where they specifically rammed a vehicle? We had guys with concussion-like effects from that. But the reality is, you know, they're gauging what is going to happen across the board, kinetically, and as you're talking about in that cyber world, in messaging and so on.
Oh, thank you. I want to turn now to a question. Oh, go ahead, Melissa, you jump in.
I'll just be very quick.
Yeah.
On the emotional side or combating this, I think it's important to build on you know, what we've already said, to note that social media companies are participating in this, that they gather information, very detailed information about what we do online, and use that information to sell our attention. And then we receive very specific ads, posts. You know, what I receive is very different from what my friend will receive, even though, you know, we're friends. So it's very, you know, focused on me as an individual. So this idea that the First Amendment, you know, is based on this marketplace of ideas where the best ideas will rise to the top, we don't have that anymore, because we are not all seeing the same thing, and we're prevented from doing that. And so, as has already been mentioned, the transparency of social media companies needing to be clear about what they're doing, what information they're gathering, and what they're showing to whom is one thing that we do need to advocate for.
The loss of the marketplace of ideas, that is so sobering. That is the foundation of our democracy, and to have it converted into a marketplace for pure profit is just, thank you. I want to turn to Victor. Victor's from Liberia. He has a question. It's kind of different things going into it, but we'll just see what the response from the panelists is. He's worried about the COVID-19 pandemic. What is the world going to do to stop COVID-19 or pandemic from spreading again? There are more threats from powerful nations that are aimed at destroying the democratic foundations. What strategy formulations can we put in play to strengthen our democracy globally? And again, this is someone speaking from Liberia's perspective, you know, would be a struggling democracy. And so what are thoughts on how maybe the US can play a role in strengthening democracy globally at the other time that other, you know, foreign actors are trying to influence ours? Are we increasing our engagement abroad in other democracies, or do you see that diminishing currently? And is that a priority for the US? So I will turn it over to who wants to jump in on that. Melissa.
Sure. This is something that I've been working on recently, and yeah, you know, I think that so many countries are struggling, and that the ideal would be for countries to work together and develop, you know, unified strategies of sharing information and of working together to, you know, develop vaccines, to distribute, you know, whatever resources, PPE, are necessary. But unfortunately, we're in a time right now where general, you know, principles of democracy and working together are a little bit challenged. And so we, in the US side, we have been urging, and there's legislation that is bipartisan that's going through Congress right now, urging the US to develop a strategy that is coordinated and that is focused on promoting leadership U.S. leadership, but also democratic countries' leadership in ensuring that responses to the pandemic are those that promote human rights, rule of law, are countering corruption, so that there's an overlay of trying to promote the best in us in responding to the pandemic and to coordinate among countries. How can we do that? I think a lot of it has to do with what I would call soft power. We need countries, not just the US, we need countries that are, that have demonstrated leadership in promoting equality and rights and freedoms for everyone, to be stepping up and leading and trying to pull countries together. I wish that, for example, UN bodies or international bodies would be more involved. It's a struggle. I'm not saying there's an answer, but there are, I think, a lot of civil society actors that are trying to push governments to do better. And I hope that they will.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'd like to comment just a little bit, and I think, and thank you for the question and your participation. But I also, in listening to Melissa's comments, I also look at the fact that certain countries now, and we'll look at ours, how we've potentially begun to distance ourselves from some of those organizations that you're talking about, some of those UN-backed organizations, some of that leadership role that we've had in the past. And when there are countries and people, and Liberia has a very obviously rich history in with the United States, but when we look at some of our allies in some of those countries out there, they are now looking at other alternatives to get some of these questions answered, and how to get that support, because there's a lack of confidence, or there's a loss of trust and confidence in some of those partners to actually get the kinds of results that they're accustomed to getting. And so I think that's going to be a challenging time when the vaccine does come up, or even up until that vaccine. You look at globally, obviously the United States has the largest number of deaths, and we have the largest number of cases. But if you look just south of us in Mexico, what's really happening in Mexico is off the charts, and what's happening in Brazil. People aren't even close to the US, relatively close to the US. The numbers are crazy. It's not what anybody was expecting. And so trying to, like you said, this has to be a team effort. This is not a one city, one person, one country effort. This has to be a multi-organizational, multinational effort to, one, catch it, second, two, be able to go back and begin to affect it, three, how do I get that vaccine out to the people that need it the most, and four, how do you follow on, what's the follow-on treatment and efforts after that?
I think if you look at the strategy of Russia really over decades, it is several-fold. One is to undermine us as a global leader in terms of our democracy and what it represents, but it's also to undermine multinational institutions, and specifically in Europe, the NATO has always been the important coalition against the Soviet Union and continues to be. So a lot of their strategies are focused on undermining the credibility of NATO and also the European Union, and thus the backing of Russia in promoting Brexit in the UK. So it's multifaceted, and we have to regain our global leadership and the responsibility that it entails, which is to promote democratic values, but also to promote multinational coalitions to address issues like the pandemic. And without that, I think we're at a tremendous disadvantage, as well as countries across the world like Liberia. So thank you very much for that question. But we have to be a leader, and if you're going to be a leader, you have to lead.
What would you all say is, do you see our posture retreating right now on the global stage? And is that correlated at all? Is that inviting more than foreign interference here at home? Or is that correlating to, okay, people aren't as you know, foreign entities are not interested in interfering as much because we are less visible on the global stage. Is there any connection there?
I think it stimulated foreign involvement in terms of our retreat, because our retreat also has gone with, I think, policies and positions, et cetera, internally in the United States that continue to foster the polarization. So the two go hand in hand.
Interesting. Melissa, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say, I agree, it makes us more vulnerable. And it also, you know, as the US does retreat in terms of, as Jose said, its participation in international institutions, but also in portraying a vision of leadership that creates a vacuum that other countries would like to fill, the vacuum of leadership. And so it creates vulnerabilities on the international sphere, but also vulnerabilities within our own country.
Fascinating.
Just one more point, when you look at what's being done internationally to deal with disinformation on social media, what you see is oftentimes the promotion of codes of principle. And there was a code of principle called the Paris Call that was developed a couple of years ago. And all Eastern or Western European countries are members. There are numerous organizations, civil society organizations that are members. There are even states and local governments here in the United States that are local members. And it's to promote a common set of principles in terms of social media itself. Noticeably absent as a signatory is the United States government. So fundamentally, there's the need to develop standards here in a new dimension. We've had those standards in news and print media historically that mainstream media has subscribed to. There weren't standards here in social media, but there's a tremendous push to develop those, and we as a nation need to be part of that.
Mm-hmm. So I've got a kind of we have less than 15 minutes left, and so I have a three-pronged question for each of you. And that is sort of, okay, I want to do a overarching policy question, an average citizen question, and then a personal question for each of you. And on the policy side, so what are the national policies, or, you know, on what we're dealing with that are not in place, but that need to be, and maybe you're shocked that they're not being developed or formulated. And things like, how do we also combat disinformation while protecting free speech? Or what is a strategy on informational warfare, or evolving, protecting ourselves nationally against these foreign threats? So just an overarching policy question for each of you. And then for the average citizen, we've touched upon this, but, you know, thinking back to George Washington's statement, which is just so penetrating, the jealousy of a free people to be constantly awake. How can we be awake to these influences right now? What's just, you know, the thing that we can take away from this panel? The topic, as you all know, of the symposium is citizenship is not a spectator sport. So how can we be so engaged in the sport and not realize, okay, no, it's up to the leaders at the national level, the policy level. They're going to figure it all out. They're going to protect us. But really, what can each citizen do to be constantly awake and to be vigilant in this era? And then I just would like to know from each of you, what drew you to this topic? How did you first get involved? Why is this important to you? So with that in mind, who would like to start us off? Okay, Jose.
Okay. So I think you did this as a trick, because knowing that English is a second language, you went really, really fast. And it took me a while to try to write all this stuff down. But I'll start first with the policy piece. You know, those policies that are in place. And we've heard discussion throughout the day as far as the policies, especially today on social media, or the lack thereof, policies that are governing social media, but not only governing, but also holding them accountable, you know, restrictions and or potential penalties. And I think that's really why some of those social media platforms are allowed to do what they do, continue to operate the way they do. And as I pointed out when I first started talking, our adversaries, they know what US laws are, they know what our policies are, and they will use them to the best of their ability to further their strategy, what it is that they want to accomplish, to be able to destabilize the democracy in the United States, or at least put it on a hold, or destabilize our relationships worldwide with other countries that we're trying to engage with. And it's not one country or two, there are multiple actors that are out there that are trying to do that. And each of them are trying to do it in their own way. Second, you talked about what can the citizen do? And I think there's a couple things. One, the first thing that the citizen can do, the average person, is inform yourself. Actually do the research, inform yourself, and so that you have an understanding the pros and cons, and then what are the things that you do to affect it is you actually go out and you push, you contact, as was stated earlier, you contact your congressional leaders, you contact your local politicians to be able to influence and to protect your freedoms, but also to hold people accountable when they are stepping outside of the boundaries. And then, personally, what kind of brought me into this, I would say more of a, as just something I went to college and I said, okay, I'm gonna be an ROTC, and everyone said, oh, Jose is 4 years and out, he'll never do more than 4 years, and then all of a sudden it's 28 years, and I really had a great time throughout. But literally, I was thinking earlier when I started talking, my very first assignment was at the very tactical level with the Infantry Battalion, in the mud, in the dirt, right there on the border. We were 35 kilometers away from the East European border, the East German border. So, I mean, it was real at that point. And then subsequent assignments working in El Salvador, very in close tactical level. And then all of a sudden going to Central Command, where I was more of at a strategic level, looking at two different complex wars and how those were affecting US policy. And then I got a chance to come back here after Afghanistan to be the Director of Army Foreign Liaison, where I dealt with 110 different countries, their military and defense attaches, and also got an opportunity to look at and work with their senior defense officials when they came and visited, but also their ambassadors, their political leadership in country, and the messaging. And and I got a chance to do that. I was blessed with an opportunity to do that for a long time. And a lot of them would talk to me about a lot of questions. And I always would say, I'm senior enough to discuss the information with you, and I'm junior enough to never be quoted as a senior military officer. And so I took that, but I also meant it in a way where I was able to establish a level of trust to where we could talk about very difficult issues. Having the Kosovar on one side and the Serbian on the other, having the Egyptian on one side and the Israeli on the other, having the, dealing with the Chinese, dealing with the Russians, to include when Russia invaded Crimea, and what they've done in eastern Ukraine now. Those are the kinds of things that when you step back, and especially for me, having been born and raised in a specific environment, and all of a sudden you step back and you're like, wow, all of this really does have an impact worldwide. And there's very long terms, as Gil has pointed out. This is not something that just started yesterday, even from the Russians and the Soviets. This is something that has always been part of their strategy to destabilize US democracy. So.
Thank you on all 3 points. Melissa or Gil would like to jump in.
You want to go, Melissa?
Sure. Let's see. When we think about national policies, in terms of trying to combat disinformation, but also protecting free speech, I think that as Americans, we tend to think, well, the government should get involved and prohibit something. And any law prohibiting disinformation is going to be a bad idea. Remember, we're Americans. We are free speech absolutists. We just don't do that. So a strategy that has been promoted during the time of COVID, and I think that this is something that we need to hold our leaders accountable to, is that, you know, we have a right to accurate, regular information from our government. And so governments putting out, you know, information that's transparent about what they're doing, about where to get reliable information. We need to be pushing our government to do that, for example. And then in terms of social media companies, I do think that it's going to be a matter of requiring that they hold up and support principles of democracy over a profit motive, which they're not going to do on their own. And so that's going to mean some kind of regulation. And yeah, well, good luck to us with that. And then finally, I would say that we need reform of laws that require foreign agents to register. That, you know, when foreign agents are in the US, they're supposed to register if they're trying to affect policy here. But the law there is very old. It is very vague. It is a terrible, you know, sort of law. So I think we need to be looking at how that's used. I would just add to what Jose said in terms of what citizens can do to be awake. I would reiterate a little bit of what I said earlier, that we need to think about our communities and act within our communities and go out to you know, reach out to people who are different from us actively as a method of combating foreign interference, like as a method of building our democracy. That is an important part of our democracy, and so I would suggest that. And then finally, what drew me to this topic, in addition, I think, to my work in Russia, you know, I started in Uzbekistan. I started my work overseas in Uzbekistan. And I was living in a country where the government there was trying to balance, you know, Russia is approaching them, China is approaching them, the US is coming to them, and they're trying to think about, well, where are our interests, or how do we work with all of these governments? And so I saw what we call the soft power, or, you know, where does US power come from? It comes from the US being a leader on issues like human rights and democracy. And so that's what initially drew me in. And then I was also in Russia when Russia invaded Ukraine. And so saw there what Russia was doing in terms of putting out messaging, and how, you know, people were fighting within Russia, within families. And so then when I came to the US, had this experience that I wanted to make sure the US was paying attention to as I came back here. That's it.
And thank you for helping us pay attention. Thank you. Gil.
Well, I'll start with the paths that got me onto this panel today, and they're really twofold. One is the BBC series, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, with Alec Guinness. And if you haven't watched it, want some binge watching, dig it up. It's incredible, and basically about the fictionalized account about the Cambridge Five, who were recruited by Russia in the 30s. So I've tracked Russian involvement in the US and in the UK for decades as a result here, and most specifically with their information warfare tactics. The other path really relates to what you referenced before, which was my experience on 9/11. I was in the next building to the World Trade Center, so felt the first plane hit and saw the second plane hit, and then witnessed the incredible bravery and sacrifice of people going into harm's way on my behalf. So I ended up adopting actually Steve Miska's brigade in Europe and its soldiers and families and wounded soldiers, and have talked about it to audiences for a number of years. And what I talk about is our duty on behalf of people who go into harm's way, who swore an oath to the Constitution, and that is to exercise all the rights of the Constitution, to vote, to read as much as we can by virtue of the free press, and to speak up by virtue of our right of free speech. So to me, that is an incredible obligation that civilians have to honor those people who go into harm's way and swear that oath. With respect to national policy, we don't have one with respect to disinformation. We need one. We need a national dialogue to deal with the issues of how to regulate. We don't want to suppress free speech, but there are many ways in which The transparency that Melissa talks about can be brought forth so we understand what we're looking at. We need to be able to identify disinformation attacks when they occur. We need to collaborate with other countries with respect to that. We need an interface between the government, the federal government, state and local governments, and also civic society organizations and all the centers of excellence that do such tremendous work on disinformation to share information, strategies, and ideas. And we need a counter messaging. One expert, I think it was Claire Wardle, said, who runs First Draft, if you have people telling you every day that the earth is flat and nobody tells you that the earth is round, eventually you're going to believe that the earth is flat. So we need a counter messaging. Finally, with respect to what we can do as individuals, there's a concept in social media literacy called lateral reading. And we all need, when content comes across our desk, don't look at the content, investigate what your search does of the source of that content and the validity of that content, and don't pass on anything that reeks of disinformation. It's like sending a friend out who's been drinking to drive on the road. We have a tremendous responsibility not to be the useful idiots that amplify disinformation that's put forth there for malevolent reasons.
Thank you all. Thank you, Gil. Thank you all so much. Panelists, you have enlightened us. You have informed us on how to be vigilant and awake, and you've inspired us with steps that we can move forward on and push our policymakers. And thank you, attendees. We're right at 9:30. Thank you for spending the hour and a half with us and diving into this topic that just had such breadth of information. I do want to let you know to go back to firstamendmentvoice.org. There's still so many panels happening, keynotes on fascinating topics today and tomorrow. Just at 11:30, I will put in a plug. 11:30 Pacific, 2:30 Eastern. There's a panel on freedom of expression and technology. So that will be a wonderful follow-on to this panel where we got into some of that. And then you have the CEO of Maestro Games and notable podcaster on there who can dive into that topic. So check out First Amendment Voice. But thank you, panelists. Thank you, participants. What a wonderful discussion. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for your leadership, Janessa. Thanks, Jose and Melissa. Great opportunity.
Yeah, many
Thank you as well.